I probably had the pleasure of teaching some of you, but forgive me if I don't remember everyone. There are some feeblenesses apparent these days. If my memory fails me, well, in general, my memories of the place are very good. In fact, Macquarie students have always been slightly different, probably because so many have been the first in the family to attend university and put their best foot forward. It was marked quite early on. As you may know or recall, I wonder, is there anyone who can recall that much? Not you. 1967 was a transition year in the New South Wales secondary education system, and about the half of that first intake in 1967 were different. They weren't the standard matric move on, and they happily chose to take modern history. In some ways they were quite conservative, but in other ways quite radical. And that probably applied to the staff too. As you may recall, the university's motto, which thankfully is enshrined in legislation, is gladly and gladly teach, which is open to jokes, but still. A quote from the great English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who famously wrote the Canterbury Tales. It may seem a bit old-fashioned now, but when Macquarie was founded, most, if not all, universities had Latin mottos. So that was one way in which Macquarie was different. In those days, Macquarie's colour was green, not maroon. We were what used to be called a greenfields university, as distinct from city-based universities. I hope the university's everlasting expansion leaves some room for that green ethos. It's still a radical idea. There were plenty more of them. How well I recall arriving here all those years ago in January 1967, it was. And I was more or less straight off from London with scarcely a penny to my name. There weren't many admin people by then, but those that were here were kind and advanced me some pay. I wonder, is there anyone here who can remember that? To tell the truth, it wasn't much. I may be a founding member of staff, but it was as a tutor, a temporary position that no longer exists. My job was to take tutorials and hand out study guides at lectures. Now, the study guide was just one thing that made Macquarie different. Arts people were good at writing them, not everybody was. Moreover, arts people soon made the most of such novelties as a semester system and continuous assessment. It all sounded too American for some, but by the 1980s the university started patting itself on the back for being so innovative. By then, in my area, by then called the School of History, Philosophy and Politics, the schedule boasted a 100-level unit in world history put up by David Christian, whose name will be very familiar to you today, numerous units in ancient history, Edwin Judge's Triumph, and I think I saw Elena Emmett here earlier, and new approaches to philosophy, such as feminism and philosophy, also politics, where psephologist Murray Goot, whom you will often read in the Sydney Morning Herald, made his name. Some of you may recall Brian Fletcher. He's recently retired as registrar after a period on the job longer than mine. Like me, Brian was sometimes asked about staying put for so long. He had an interesting answer, that he had actually lived through 5 versions of a university. I've only got a few minutes left, so I won't attempt to say what he might have meant by that. But I will say that by the 1990s, when I was struggling up the greasy pole, the status of arts was beginning to change. Whereas history began as a school in a college of arts and sciences, we were eventually rejigged as a department in a faculty of arts, which I am reminded as a very recent innovation indeed. And it was an option that was rejected by the founders of this university as being old-fashioned. Well, it's a big show now. My main regret is that it's really big and I've lost track with some people, but I'd like to keep going. A second thing about what we've been and are now in arts, I'd say, is that somewhere along the way, the emphasis seemed to shift away from teaching and the humanities due to the coming of the research culture, quote unquote, and a new emphasis on internationalism, with all that that has meant by extra funding. It certainly meant a lot to members of the Faculty of Arts, though we usually think it's there for the sciences. For example, those who studied French literature or Chinese politics. I was lucky as an Australianist, as the two areas I was interested in had both clear international dimensions. I'm not here to talk about myself, but one of those areas was alternative religion. You see, I am a child of the 60s. And the other has been biography, especially the writer Miles Franklin, who spent a good part of her adult life in America and England. I should say, though, you mustn't miss an opportunity to make a political point, that though it wasn't really so much as external funding, but regular periods of study leave, which enabled that work to continue. So guard it with your lives. As well, I have been a cheapie, as I've always needed to be in Sydney. Miles donated her papers, which are voluminous, to the Mitchell Library, which is just down the road. I think I probably spent about a quarter of my life there. Overall, it seems that for all the changes, as a field of teaching and research, arts at Macquarie has held its own. I note with pleasure that although funding cuts since the 1990s have made things worrisome, my colleagues seem to be as committed to the basics as ever, to the creation and communication of knowledge. When you think of the survival of the culture and such remarkable achievements as the Macquarie Dictionary, to name but one, it's only right to celebrate the faculty's achievements at this time. Thank you.